this is my review of Mob Psycho 100. Okay, so in this episode, Reigen is actually brought in to do an exorcism on live television. But here's the interesting thing about it. It's not actually an exorcism. So the whole thing is staged by the studio, who hired a professional actor to pretend to be possessed by an evil spirit. And sure enough, Kieran Jodo knows this and even mentions it offhand to Reigen, pointing out that he's going to be going on as scripted. But when Reigen finds out that it's actually a scripted show, realizes that maybe he can't actually exorcise the spirit and decides to take the credit for it. So Reigen gets up on stage and attempts to exorcise the evil spirit. But here's the ironic part. Reigen knows that it's an evil spirit, but what he doesn't realize is that it's actually a case of Occam's razor. The simplest solution is often the correct one. Case in point, Reigen spends a full half an hour trying to exorcise a spirit that doesn't exist, and then Kieran Jodo gets up and reveals that the kid was never possessed to begin with and was actually an actor the whole time. And sure enough, the kid stands up, reveals that he's an actor, and that he was never actually possessed. So yeah, Reigen is pretty much in that single moment gets his spotlight taken away and kind of confirmed to be a fraud, sort of. So now with that moment, everybody begins to question why Reigen spent a half an hour exorcising a spirit that didn't exist, and Kieran Jodo presses him on it, and eventually Reigen slowly digs a hole that causes him to eventually ruin his entire reputation. And after this point, nobody will hire him anymore. He's basically ruined his own reputation as an actual psychic, so now nobody will trust him with a job anymore, and now everybody hates him. And even the media has been trying to hound him because he made his first major debut on live television, and it wound up blowing up in his face. So now he's in a very tragic position where he now has to recuperate everything, and sure enough, is trying to get people to stop talking about him in a negative way, to no avail. Mob, meanwhile, has found out from some of his friends at school that this has been playing out, and realizes that Reigen might be in a bit of trouble. Although he points out that this is all part of Reigen's plan. So, it's because he remembers a conversation he had with Reigen a while back about how he wanted to become famous, and realizes that this was all going to play out according to Reigen's grand plan. Which shows that Mob, despite realizing that Reigen kind of said some things that he probably shouldn't have, is deep down still a good person who still trusts him, at least to an extent. So Reigen eventually is hounded by the reporters so much that he eventually decides to hold a press conference to address some of their concerns. And sure enough, when he gets up, he takes full control of the situation, pointing out that that nobody would actually be satisfied with the answer of him being an Esper or not, because they wouldn't be satisfied unless he said no. And also he points out that the main reason he's there at all is because they pressured him into doing it. But case in point, despite everything else that's been going on about him having spiritual powers or not, he answers every question truthfully, and sure enough, he's able to successfly answer them all. So until it gets to the point where he's asked about some of his childhood stuff, where he's asked what if being famous was part of his plan, and why he decided to become a psychic in the first place, which makes Reigen think a little bit. He realizes he doesn't really know why he became a psychic in the first place. In fact, according to him, he wanted to quit being a psychic almost immediately. He bought his office on a whim, quit his original job on a whim, and at that point was believing himself to just be a glorified masseuse. That is, until he met Mob around the time he was thinking of quitting. And while he initially dismissed Mob as a kid with an overactive imagination or even a pathological liar, after seeing Mob use his psychic powers firsthand, he decides to help Mob out by teaching him how to use his psychic powers. And sure enough, that begins to bring Reigen to another line of thought, which is I've been holding this kid back for 4 years. It's time to stop. So, at which point he decides to address Mob directly. He hopes and prays Mob is actually watching the broadcast in some way, shape, or form. And then points out just how much Mob has actually grown in the past 4 years, and which confuses all of the people in the news outlet. But then everything starts floating, and with the implication being that it's Mob who's actually doing it. So, and Reigen takes full advantage of the situation and uses this as evidence to prove that he does indeed have spiritual powers, and then ends the press conference then and there. At which point he meets up with Mob and asks Mob if he's heard any of the rumors and what they're saying about him, and if he knew about it. And Mob says that he already knew what Reigen was since the beginning. And then points out that Reigen has, to him, always been a good person. So Reigen, gratified that Mob still thinks so highly of him, decides that they should get ramen and reconcile their differences. And Mob gives him a belated birthday wish. So this episode ended with a bit of a wholesome ending. So it shows that yes, Reigen doesn't really have psychic powers, but he mostly relies on Mob to help him out in that department. But deep down, he's still a good person who is actually good at his job with everything except the psychic powers thing. So he isn't actually a fraud, as people have been calling him, but he is different. He doesn't exactly have psychic powers, but he did want to quit being a psychic then and there, but he eventually realizes that he hasn't really grown at all. Meanwhile, Mob has grown in leaps and bounds since they've met. So Reigen realizes now that he hasn't really grown as a person and decides to start, which is kind of where his story arc starts, where he starts growing as a person and becoming a better person. So, and he realizes this through Mob. So this episode was just interesting in that regard. And also, Kieran Jodo got his when he found out that Reigen may in fact have psychic powers when he sees what happened on the news broadcast. He was hoping Reigen would embarrass himself even further and dig himself into an even deeper hole, but the exact opposite actually happened, and now Kieran Jodo is stunned at a loss for words. So, yeah, Kieran Jodo got his in the end. He framed Reigen into being this fake psychic, but as it turns out, he underestimated Reigen's ability to touch other people. So, yeah, Reigen wound up winning the day in the end. Kieran Jodo wound up being screwed over because his plan failed. And sure enough, we're going to be seeing Reigen and Mob reconciling their differences and working toward becoming better people together, starting in the next episode. So, if you guys have seen this episode of Mob Psycho 100, what did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Facebook and on Twitter in the description below. And also, check out my Patreon in the description below as well if you want to help support the show. It's only a couple bucks a month. It really helps me out, and you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that are my way saying thanks. So be sure to check those out in the description below as well. Again, it's only a couple bucks. It helps me out, and so help support me, and I'll help support you guys in turn. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!